They thought they were untouchable, Russian generals, hidden deep inside a fortified underground tunnel base. For months, Ukraine had been watching, waiting, calculating every move. The generals believed concrete and steel would protect them. But then came the deafening roar from the skies. A single JDAM bomb, weighing nearly 900 kilograms, turned their secret safe haven into a tomb. This was not just a strike. It was a message: nowhere is safe. The hunt begins. War is not just fought on open battlefields. It is fought in the shadows, with intelligence, patience, and precision. When the war between Russia and Ukraine dragged into its second year, the Russians adapted their strategy. Instead of exposing their commanders near the front lines, they began setting up heavily fortified tunnel bases. These underground networks, carved beneath layers of soil and reinforced with concrete, were meant to shield generals and officers from Ukrainian drones and artillery. The most important of these was a hidden command post near the occupied territories, where several high-ranking Russian officials gathered to coordinate operations. At first glance, the location seemed perfect. Buried deep, connected to supply tunnels, and guarded by surface troops, it was thought to be impenetrable. But in war, arrogance is a dangerous weakness. The Russians believed their bunker was invisible, yet Ukrainian intelligence had already locked onto it. The hunt began months earlier, when intercepted communications hinted at unusual movement of senior officers. Ukrainian scouts noticed convoys that avoided main roads, always diverting toward a suspicious area. Drones tracked supply trucks unloading materials near what seemed like ordinary hillsides. Something was hidden there, and Ukraine was determined to find out what. Unlike quick raids or drone ambushes, this mission required patience. Ukrainian intelligence agents pieced together the puzzle troop movements, intercepted chatter, satellite images, and drone footage. Slowly, a picture emerged. The Russians had transformed an abandoned Soviet-era facility into a modern tunnel base. This was no ordinary shelter. It was a headquarters where generals felt confident enough to stay for days, believing they were shielded from airstrikes. But Ukraine had something new, something Russia did not expect. Western allies had provided them with JDAM-ER kits, turning ordinary bombs into precision-guided weapons. These smart bombs could glide over 70 kilometers and strike within meters of their target. Among them was a monster, the 900-kilogram version. Designed to obliterate hardened structures, it was perfect for the underground base. Still, such a strike could not be rushed. Ukraine needed to be absolutely certain that the Russian generals were inside. For weeks, they monitored the tunnel. They tracked encrypted calls. They followed the patterns of vehicles entering and exiting. Then came the breakthrough. Signals intelligence confirmed that a major strategy meeting of high-ranking Russian officers was scheduled. If Ukraine was going to act, this was the moment. Every detail mattered: the timing of the flight, the angle of attack, the precision coordinates. Unlike artillery, which could pound an area endlessly, this strike had to be exact. One chance, one shot. Inside the base, the Russian officers believed they were safe. They had gathered to discuss troop rotations, logistics, and the next push along the front. Some even laughed at the idea of Ukrainian drones ever finding them underground. What they did not realize was that Ukrainian eyes were already locked on them from above. The Ukrainian Air Force prepared for the mission in silence. Pilots were briefed, bombs were armed, coordinates were entered. There was no room for error. This was not just about eliminating officers. It was about sending a message to the entire Russian command structure. The moment had finally come. The roar of the aircraft echoed high above the battlefield. At first, the Russians inside the tunnel heard nothing. Then, in a matter of seconds, the ground shook with unimaginable force. A massive JDAM, weighing nearly a ton, slammed into the hillside, penetrating layers of rock and concrete before detonating with apocalyptic power. The tunnel that once symbolized safety became a death trap. Fire and shockwaves tore through corridors, collapsing walls and suffocating those inside. For the Russian generals, there was no escape. For Ukraine, it was justice delivered with devastating precision. And this was only the beginning of a larger story, one that showed the world how patience, intelligence, and modern weaponry could turn the tide of war. The aftermath of the strike, when the 900-kilogram JDAM detonated, the earth itself seemed to roar. Even kilometers away, locals felt the tremor, as if an earthquake had struck. Dust and smoke rose from the hillside, and a massive crater marked the spot where moments earlier an underground stronghold had stood. But the true destruction lay beneath, where concrete ceilings cracked, steel doors twisted, and entire chambers caved in. For a few minutes, the outside world had no idea what had just happened. Ukrainian forces, monitoring the strike from drones and command centers, held their breath. Silence filled the air. Then came the first signs. The tunnel entrances had collapsed inward, fires erupted from ventilation shafts, and emergency vehicles began rushing toward the site. The strike had hit its mark. Inside, chaos reigned. Survivors stumbled through smoke-filled corridors, disoriented and injured. Communication systems were severed, radios went silent, and backup power failed. For the Russian generals and officers caught in the blast, the so-called fortress of safety had turned into a coffin. Some tried to reach escape tunnels, but falling debris blocked exits. Others never had a chance. The sheer force of the explosion crushed entire rooms in an instant. The Ukrainian command center received confirmation within minutes. Intercepted Russian radio chatter spoke of casualties among high-ranking officials. Confusion and panic spread through the surviving units. Reports described senior officers missing, trapped, or presumed dead. To Ukraine, this was more than a tactical victory. It was psychological warfare at its peak. News of the strike spread quickly across the front lines. Russian soldiers whispered about the attack, their confidence shaken. If their generals could be targeted so precisely, what hope did ordinary troops have? The myth of invincibility surrounding Russian command bunkers was shattered. The soldiers who once believed their leaders directed the war from untouchable sanctuaries now realized no place was safe. On the Ukrainian side, the mood was electric. Soldiers on the ground felt an enormous boost in morale. For months, they had endured artillery barrages, drone attacks, and brutal offensives. The successful elimination of top commanders gave them a surge of hope. It proved that patience and intelligence could strike back against overwhelming force. One Ukrainian officer summed it up: "We waited for them to crawl into their holes, and then we buried them in it." Internationally, the strike sent shockwaves as well. Analysts in Western capitals studied satellite images of the aftermath, confirming the precision of the attack. Military experts noted how Ukraine had not just destroyed a bunker, but had also disrupted Russia's chain of command. Generals are not easily replaced. Their loss creates delays, confusion, and hesitation on the battlefield. Moscow, however, reacted differently. Russian state media downplayed the event, calling it an enemy propaganda story. Officials denied any significant losses, insisting the strike caused only minor damage. But behind closed doors, intelligence leaks painted a darker picture. Multiple generals were confirmed dead, along with dozens of staff officers. Emergency recovery teams were seen working at the site for days, struggling to retrieve bodies and equipment from the collapsed tunnels. The secrecy only fueled speculation. Ukrainian officials hinted at the strike's success, but refrained from naming names immediately. Instead, they let Russia's silence speak louder than words. Every hour Moscow avoided addressing the loss, the world became more convinced of the strike's devastating impact. For the civilians living near the occupied zone, the explosion was both terrifying and relieving. Terrifying because the sheer blast reminded them of the war's brutality. Relieving because it meant the occupiers who had controlled their towns were no longer untouchable. Some even whispered that justice had finally found those who orchestrated the suffering of ordinary people. But as the dust settled, the significance of the strike became clear. This was not merely about one bunker. It was a demonstration of Ukraine's evolving capability. The ability to track, target, and eliminate enemy command centers using advanced weaponry showed a level of precision once thought impossible in this conflict. The Russians could hide underground, but they could not hide from the sky. In military terms, the elimination of high-ranking officers disrupted operations for weeks. Orders had to be rerouted, replacements scrambled, and confidence rebuilt. Every delay on the Russian side gave Ukraine breathing room on the battlefield, and in a war where momentum shifts with each passing day, that breathing room was priceless. Still, the strike raised new questions. How many more such targets existed? Would Russia move its command posts even deeper underground? And most importantly, how would they retaliate? For Ukraine, the success was undeniable, but it was also a warning. When you strike so close to the heart of the enemy's command, you must be prepared for the storm that follows. The world watched closely, waiting to see Russia's next move. But one thing was certain: the myth of safety in underground fortresses had been destroyed, and the war had entered a new, more dangerous phase. Russia's retaliation and escalation, the strike on the underground tunnel base, was a devastating blow to Russia's war effort. But in war, humiliation rarely goes unanswered. For the Kremlin, the destruction of a command post and the death of senior officers was more than a battlefield loss. It was a challenge to their authority, a direct insult that demanded retaliation. Within days, the response began, and it was ruthless. Across the front lines, Russian artillery suddenly intensified. Cities that had been experiencing relative calm were once again under heavy bombardment. Missiles struck power plants, water stations, and residential districts. It was as if Moscow wanted to send a brutal message: if you target our leaders, we will make your civilians suffer. The timing was no coincidence. Every strike on Ukrainian infrastructure in the weeks after the JDAM attack carried the shadow of revenge. But the retaliation was not only about missiles and artillery. Russian commanders reorganized their tactics. Survivors from the destroyed tunnel base were reassigned, and replacements for the fallen generals were flown in from Moscow. These new officers, however, were paranoid. They no longer trusted underground bunkers, no matter how fortified. Instead, they began relocating command posts deeper into Russian-held territory, farther from the range of Ukrainian JDAM strikes. This shift created ripple effects on the battlefield. By pulling their commanders back, Russian units closer to the front found themselves operating with less direct supervision. Communication became slower, decision-making less efficient. Soldiers felt abandoned, while junior officers carried responsibilities far heavier than before. Ukraine's intelligence services quickly noted these fractures. The strike had not only eliminated generals, it had forced structural changes that weakened Russia's control. Still, Russia needed a show of force to restore its reputation, both domestically and internationally. That show came in the form of relentless missile barrages on Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. Air raid sirens became a nightly ritual. Civilian casualties rose, buildings crumbled, and power grids flickered under the weight of repeated strikes. Russian state television proudly broadcast these attacks, framing them as punishment for Ukraine's supposed aggression. Yet behind the propaganda, cracks appeared. The Kremlin could boast about firing missiles, but it could not erase the fact that its generals had been caught and killed in their own hideout. Rumors spread among Russian soldiers about the strike, despite official denials. Some whispered that their leaders had been careless. Others wondered if betrayal within their own ranks had led Ukraine to the bunker. The paranoia deepened. Meanwhile, Ukraine's morale continued to climb. The retaliation was brutal, but civilians and soldiers alike understood why it was happening. They saw the missile strikes for what they were: desperation. Russia could fire at cities, but it could not undo the loss of its commanders. Ukraine's narrative turned the tragedy of civilian suffering into a symbol of resilience. Every blackout, every destroyed building, became a reminder of the price of defiance and the determination to endure. On the diplomatic front, the JDAM strike created new tensions. Russia accused Western nations of directly enabling the attack, since the precision bomb was American-made. Moscow warned that such support made NATO a legitimate target, escalating its rhetoric dangerously. Western governments, however, defended Ukraine's right to defend itself. In fact, the success of the strike encouraged some allies to send additional advanced weaponry, further fueling Russia's anger. Inside the Kremlin, President Vladimir Putin faced mounting pressure. The death of high-ranking officers embarrassed the military elite, and questions arose about the vulnerability of their command structure. Retaliation had to be more than symbolic. It had to show strength. Thus, Russian forces increased efforts to hunt down Ukrainian intelligence operatives, striking suspected hideouts, arresting collaborators, and tightening security in occupied territories. But the damage was already done. No matter how many missiles Russia fired, no matter how many civilians it targeted, the psychological impact of the JDAM strike remained. For the first time, Russian generals had learned what it meant to be hunted. They were no longer untouchable figures issuing orders from deep bunkers. They were targets, just like the soldiers they commanded. The war had shifted. From this moment on, every Russian officer stepping into a meeting room, every convoy traveling a back road, every underground base carved into a hillside carried the weight of fear. And fear, once it grips an army, can be more destructive than any weapon. For Ukraine, the retaliation was expected. For Russia, it was necessary. But for the world watching, it raised a terrifying question: if one precision strike could destabilize the command of one of the largest armies on Earth, what escalation might come next? The answer was looming on the horizon. Russia's retaliation was not the end. It was only the beginning of a darker chapter in the war. Intelligence wars, spies, drones, and secrets. In modern warfare, battles are often decided long before the first missile is fired. They are fought not only on the ground, but also in the invisible realm of intelligence, surveillance, and precision strikes. The destruction of the Russian tunnel base was a masterclass in this new kind of war, a silent, relentless hunt orchestrated with patience and technology. And at the heart of it all were the unsung heroes, Ukraine's intelligence operatives, spies embedded in enemy territory, and drones that patrolled the skies like relentless sentinels. Before the JDAM strike, months of meticulous reconnaissance had already taken place. Ukrainian intelligence agencies had to map every tunnel, every supply route, every guard rotation without being detected. This was no simple task. Russian forces had fortified the area with layers of anti-drone defenses, jamming systems, and patrols. One wrong move, and a UAV could be shot down or a spy captured. But Ukraine's operatives were skilled, and the operation was planned with military precision. Spies working deep behind enemy lines gathered critical information. They intercepted communications, photographed maps, and even infiltrated Russian supply convoys. Every detail mattered: the width of corridors, the placement of ventilation shafts, and the thickness of reinforced walls. Each piece of intelligence would determine the success or failure of the strike. A single miscalculation could mean disaster. Above ground, drones became Ukraine's eyes and ears. Equipped with thermal imaging and high-resolution cameras, they scanned the landscape relentlessly. Day and night, they recorded the movement of vehicles and personnel, creating a digital map of the tunnel complex. The drones captured subtle patterns: convoys arriving at unusual hours, officers entering secured entrances, and the timing of supply drops. This information allowed Ukrainian planners to know exactly when the Russian generals would be inside, ready for the strike. But the intelligence war was not one-sided. Russia fought back with electronic warfare units scrambling communications and attempting to hack drone feeds. They also planted misinformation, hoping to confuse Ukrainian analysts. Some convoys were deliberately routed in deceptive patterns, and decoy structures were erected to mislead surveillance. For every step Ukraine took, Russia countered. But Ukraine's persistence and technological edge proved decisive. Cyber operations added another layer of complexity. Ukrainian hackers intercepted encrypted messages, decrypted them, and delivered actionable intelligence to field commanders. Each intercepted conversation was like a puzzle piece, revealing command movements and pinpointing vulnerabilities. The synchronization of cyber, drone, and human intelligence created a precision strike capability that Russia had not fully anticipated. The psychological dimension of this intelligence war was equally critical. Russian officers believed they were hidden in a fortified, secret tunnel. They underestimated the reach and ingenuity of Ukrainian surveillance. Confidence in a supposedly impenetrable bunker led them to lower their guard, conduct strategy meetings, and even discuss sensitive operations openly. This complacency was exactly what Ukrainian intelligence needed. Patience, observation, and careful analysis turned arrogance into vulnerability. From the Ukrainian side, the intelligence network was vast but coordinated. Field operatives reported to regional command centers, drones were monitored by dedicated teams, and data was analyzed in real time. Every step of the operation had been simulated, and contingency plans were in place. The strike itself was the culmination of countless hours of effort that went largely unnoticed by the world. Intelligence rarely makes headlines, but in this case, it had determined life or death for entire groups of Russian commanders. The success of the tunnel strike also reshaped the battlefield in subtle ways. Russian forces became wary of movement, even in supposedly secure zones. Convoys slowed, officers avoided predictable patterns, and underground bases were reinforced further, but at great cost. For Ukraine, this shift created new opportunities. Troop movements, supply lines, and command coordination were disrupted. What had been a rigid, hierarchical structure was now strained under constant surveillance and fear. In this era, drones and spies have become as lethal as bombs. The tunnel strike was not only an act of destruction, it was a lesson in modern warfare. Intelligence, patience, and precision could overcome even the most heavily fortified structures. Ukraine had shown that in the war of shadows, knowledge was power, and the skies above could see everything. As the dust settled on the crater, the real story was not just of fire and explosion, it was the invisible war that had made that destruction possible. And in the intelligence battles that followed, both sides knew one thing with certainty: no secret was truly safe: the human cost. Soldiers and civilians caught in the Crossfire war is often measured in strategic victories, battlefield gains, and intelligence successes. But behind every tactical triumph lies a human story. The strike on the Russian tunnel base, while a major success for Ukraine, also illuminated the devastating ripple effects of modern warfare. Soldiers, civilians, and even families far from the front lines were touched by consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. On the Ukrainian side, soldiers celebrated the elimination of Russian generals. It was a rare victory in a war defined by stalemates and high casualties. Yet the strike also carried risks. Precision strikes in areas near civilian settlements required careful coordination to avoid collateral damage. Any miscalculation could have led to innocent lives lost. Pilots, drone operators, and intelligence officers carried the weight of this responsibility. 4 weeks after the strike, Ukrainian commanders conducted debriefings not only on operational success but also on minimizing unintended casualties, understanding that even a justified strike could haunt their conscience. For Russian troops and commanders, the psychological shock was immediate and profound. Losing senior officers in an underground tunnel base was not just a logistical blow. it was a demoralizing reminder of vulnerability. Soldiers who had previously followed orders with confidence now questioned every command, every strategy. Some hesitated in combat, wary that Ukrainian intelligence was always watching, that any misstep could bring destruction from above. The loss of trusted leaders disrupted morale and coordination, adding layers of fear and confusion to an already grueling conflict. Yet the human cost extended far beyond combatants. For civilians living near occupied zones, the war was an ever-present threat. Missile barrages launched in retaliation struck towns, infrastructure, and homes. Families were forced to flee with only what they could carry, seeking shelter in basements, schools, or churches. Essential services, water, electricity, hospitals, were disrupted, compounding the hardships of daily survival. Even children, who might never have imagined the horrors of war, witnessed explosions, sirens, and loss firsthand. These traumatic experiences would leave psychological scars for years to come. The tunnel strike itself sparked stories of survival and tragedy. Locals who had noticed the convoys and construction above the secret facility now spoke of massive tremors and clouds of dust rising from the hillside. Some Russian soldiers managed to escape the collapse, injured and traumatized, wandering in the forests and fields surrounding the crater. Ukrainian forces occasionally encountered these survivors, who provided intelligence inadvertently, while their own lives were saved from further harm. Yet many were not so fortunate. The bulk of the command staff perished, leaving grieving families and unanswered questions about the fates of their loved ones. Humanitarian organizations struggled to operate amidst escalating hostilities. Evacuation routes became dangerous, supply lines unreliable, and medical facilities overwhelmed. The strike demonstrated the precision and intelligence capability of Ukraine, but it also highlighted the unavoidable collateral toll of modern warfare. Every strategic decision carried weight. Every strike echoed through the lives of those caught in the conflict. Stories emerged of Ukrainian soldiers who visited bombed-out neighborhoods to deliver aid, providing food, water, and medical support to civilians traumatized by retaliation strikes. These moments offered a stark contrast to the violence of the battlefield, reminders that even in war, acts of humanity persist. Civilians, while caught between two armed forces, became witnesses to both destruction and resilience. The strike also sparked reflection within military circles worldwide. Analysts debated the ethics of precision strikes targeting high-ranking officers. Was the tactical advantage worth the risk to civilians? Could wars be fought in ways that minimize human suffering, or was modern warfare inherently indiscriminate? For Ukraine, the answer lay in precision, intelligence, and careful planning. But the human consequences were unavoidable. Ultimately,